Part 1. A life dedicated to dance and family. Margaret Ann Shade was born on June 28, 1952 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, United States. Raised in a loving and close-knit family, she was the youngest daughter of John and Ellen Shade and grew up alongside 3 sisters and a brother. From an early age, a passion for art and literature was a defining trait among the Shades. Music and dance were part of daily life, and Margaret and her sisters quickly stood out in this world. Dance was more than just a hobby for Margaret, it was a true purpose in life. Even as a child, she and her sisters learned ballet, tap, and ballroom dancing. During the vibrant 1960s and 70s, local dances were major social events, and the Shade sisters became charismatic figures at these gatherings. This shared love for dance led Margaret and her sisters to take an important step. They opened a studio together, the Shade Sisters Dance Studio. There, Margaret not only taught dance steps but also instilled fundamental values such as discipline, dedication, and the joy that art brings. Former students fondly remember how Margaret always welcomed them with a warm smile, conducting her classes with firmness yet affection. But Margaret's life wasn't just about dance. At 21, she got married and soon became the mother of 2 daughters, Helen and Peggy. Unfortunately, the marriage turned out to be abusive, and after 4 difficult years, Margaret chose to divorce. Now, as a single mother, she had to work tirelessly to support her daughters. In addition to working exhaustively at the dance studio, Margaret took on side jobs as a waitress on weekends to supplement her income. Despite financial struggles and physical exhaustion, she never lost the sparkle in her eyes. Her resilient spirit led her to find creative ways to always be well-dressed, with flawless makeup and neatly styled hair, even when money was tight. Fate, however, gave her a second chance at love. In 1982, Margaret remarried, this time to David Sumney, a respected businessman in the dental field. David was a university professor and owned 2 clinics, ensuring a comfortable financial life. Upon formalizing the marriage, he also took on the role of father to Helen and Peggy, treating them as his own daughters. The family seemed complete, but both Margaret and David wished to have a child together. For years, Margaret tried to conceive, and when her youngest daughter was already 12 years old, the long-awaited moment arrived. She was expecting a baby boy. The news brought joy to the entire family. On April 26, 1989, David Sumney Jr. was born, a healthy and beloved baby. Margaret was a devoted mother, always showing affection for her 3 children. However, it was evident to everyone that little David Jr. received special treatment from his parents. He grew up surrounded by attention, indulgence, and privileges that his sisters had not experienced to the same extent. When David Jr. turned 1, his father decided to expand his business and opened a new dental office, this time in McMurray. With this prosperous phase, the family moved to a new home, a spacious and luxurious property located at 113 Inverness Drive. The house was impressive: 5 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, an indoor pool, and a vast living area. Everything suggested that Margaret and her family would live unforgettable moments of happiness there. But not even the comfort and grandeur of that home were enough to provide little David Jr. with a healthy and balanced childhood. From a very young age, the boy had difficulty making friends. Despite his parents' efforts to socialize him, no child seemed to stay by his side for long. Helen, his eldest sister, recalls a striking episode that revealed troubling traits in her brother's behavior. She was around 18 or 19 years old when she witnessed a terrifying moment. Her brother, still a small child, was playing in the garden with a friend when suddenly Margaret ran into the house crying and desperate. Between sobs, she kept repeating to her husband that David Jr. had done something only people with psychopathic tendencies were capable of. Running outside to see what had happened, Helen found her brother holding the lifeless body of a small bird. He had crushed it with his own hands without showing any sign of regret or remorse. The scene was burned into the family's memory. At that moment, although no one could predict what the future held, it was clear that something about little David Jr. was not normal. Part 2. a troubled son, and a broken marriage. David Jr.'s childhood was marked by privileges and an elite education. His parents enrolled him in prestigious schools, hoping he would follow in his father's footsteps and achieve academic and professional success. After attending public elementary school, he was admitted to Hillcrest Christian Academy, one of the most renowned preparatory schools in the region. David and Margaret dreamed that their son would one day attend a prestigious university like Harvard and build a successful career. However, from a young age, he already displayed spoiled and manipulative behavior. He quickly learned to use tantrums to get what he wanted, and even went as far as demanding money from his parents for simple tasks, such as behaving at the dinner table, getting in the car to go to school, or even taking a bath. Ashamed in public, David and Margaret often gave in to their son's demands, reinforcing his manipulative tendencies. Over time, this indulgent upbringing resulted in a young man who was increasingly self-centered and convinced that he deserved privileges without making any effort to earn them. While their son grew up surrounded by luxuries, his parents' marriage began to crumble. In 1998, when David Jr. was 9 years old, conflicts between Margaret and David intensified. 3 years later, in 2001, they finally divorced. The couple had married under a prenuptial agreement, meaning Margaret had no legal claim to the luxurious house they had lived in for years. David remained in the property while Margaret moved into a modest townhouse where she lived alone with David Jr. Her daughters, now adults, had their own lives and no longer lived with their mother. David Jr.'s custody was shared, so he spent alternating weeks with each parent. Because the division was equal, David was not required to pay child support, only spousal support to Margaret. However, the amount she received was not enough to cover her expenses, forcing her to give up her share in the dance studio she co-owned with her sisters and find a steady job. Thanks to her refined manners, education, and social skills, she secured a job as a sales associate at Saks 57, a luxury department store. Although it didn't offer a high salary, the job provided benefits and allowed her to maintain a decent lifestyle. Meanwhile, David Jr. enrolled at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., majoring in mathematics. His father covered the tuition fees, but under one condition: he would continue to pay only if Jr. maintained good grades. By 2010, David began to suspect that his son was hiding something. He suspected that Jr. was forging his report cards and possibly not even attending classes. To confirm his suspicions, he asked Margaret to make a surprise visit to their son on campus. Margaret agreed and went to Washington. What she saw unsettled her. On her way back to Pennsylvania, she made a stop in New York to visit her daughter, who immediately noticed a bruise on her mother's forehead. When asked about the injury, Margaret claimed she had fallen and hit her head during the visit to her son. However, her nervous and hesitant demeanor suggested otherwise. Her daughter began to suspect that Margaret was trying to protect Jr. from something more serious. David's suspicions were soon confirmed. Investigations revealed that Jr. had not been attending classes, and the university decided to expel him. With nowhere to live, he was forced to return to Pennsylvania, splitting his time between his father's house and his mother's small townhouse. In the months that followed, David Jr. adopted an undisciplined routine. He spent his days lifting weights and obsessively training at home, claiming he was preparing for something big. At night, he would go out, saying he was working, but in reality, he frequented bars and parties, where he drank excessively. This reckless lifestyle soon led to legal trouble. In April 2011, he was stopped at a DUI checkpoint and cited for driving under the influence. His driver's license was suspended for 6 months, but after completing some community service hours, the suspension was reduced to 3 months. Even without a valid license, this did not stop him from continuing to drink. As pressure from his parents to find a job increased, Jr. came up with an unexpected announcement. He claimed to have been recruited by the U.S. Navy to become a Navy SEAL, an elite military position considered one of the most dangerous in the world. The news caught everyone by surprise. Navy SEAL training is extremely rigorous, requiring dedication, physical endurance, and discipline. Margaret was extremely proud of her son. At work, She couldn't hide her joy when talking about her son now being a Special Forces agent. Whenever someone praised her, Margaret would proudly take out her phone and show pictures of Junior in military uniforms. Finally, David Jr. seemed to be on the right path. However, not everyone was convinced. His father, David, although pleased to see his son seemingly more focused, still had doubts about the truth of the story. He knew that his son continued to spend irresponsibly, accumulating credit card debt and saving nothing. Moreover, his abusive behavior had not changed. Suspicions that something was wrong only grew when, in June 2014, David Jr. was accused of threatening a man's life during a bar fight. 2 months later, in August of the same year, Margaret filed a police report against her own son. But this was not an isolated incident. It was just the beginning of a violent spiral that would put Margaret's life in grave danger. Part 3. The fake military career and the escalation of violence. The report Margaret filed against her own son marked a turning point in their relationship. For years, she had done everything to protect Junior, believing he could change. But this time, fear took over. The reason for the complaint was physical violence. David Jr. had asked his mother for money and, after she refused, he broke into her room and stole one of her designer handbags. Margaret tried to stop him, warning that she would report him if he left with the bag. Junior's reaction was immediate. He violently attacked her. When the police arrived at the residence, they found Margaret visibly injured. Despite her initial relief at seeing the police intervene, Margaret refused to formally press charges. The reason? Fear of damaging her son's supposed military career. Time passed, and 7 months later, in March 2015, another complaint was filed, this time by a neighbor of Junior's father, David Sumney. She called the police after hearing desperate screams and the sound of breaking glass coming from the dentist's home. When officers arrived at the residence, they saw through the window that a physical altercation was in progress. Without hesitation, they broke down the door. The scene was alarming. Junior, a strong 24-year-old man, was on top of his elderly father, who was trying in vain to defend himself. The reason for the fight? Junior wanted his father to pay for a vacation trip, and David had refused. David was tired of supporting an adult son who showed neither responsibility nor gratitude. Throughout his childhood and youth, Junior had received privileges most people could only dream of: a comfortable home, elite education, and a life without financial struggles. Yet he never valued any of it. The beating David suffered that night was brutal. When paramedics took him to the hospital, the diagnoses were shocking: a dislocated shoulder, broken ribs, severe bruising on his groin, cranial trauma, vertebral displacement, and spinal cord injuries. David spent 3 days in the ICU before being transferred to a rehabilitation clinic, from which he would never leave. He never fully recovered from the assault by his own son. Junior, on the other hand, had his bail paid by a friend and awaited trial in freedom. While waiting for his court date, he struck again. In 2016, Margaret once again had to flee her home for safety. With 2 broken ribs, she sought refuge at a neighbor's house before calling the police. Junior was drunk and furious, and this attack had been even more vicious than the last. He grabbed her by the chest and squeezed tightly, saying that this was how Navy SEALs treated their enemies. Once again, the reason for the assault was financial. Margaret refused to give him money, and he took out his rage on her. Despite the brutality, Margaret once again downplayed the charges. To avoid her son going to prison, she reported the incident as a mere threat rather than an assault. 3 months later, Junior was finally tried for the attack on his father. His sentence was shockingly lenient: 8 months in jail, of which he served only 4 for good behavior and participation in an alcohol rehabilitation program. David never recovered. A year after the sentencing, he passed away in 2018 at the age of 74. Although the cause of death was not directly linked to the injuries he suffered, the family blamed Junior for their father's premature demise. One would expect that this tragedy would serve as a lesson for David Jr., but he learned nothing. After leaving prison, he was caught driving under the influence again. His blood alcohol level was twice the legal limit. This was the third time he had been arrested for drunk driving. By law, he should have paid a $6,000 fine and served 3 months in jail. However, he got away once again. When stopped by the officer, he blatantly lied, claiming he had been drinking because he was traumatized after a dangerous Navy SEAL mission. In reality, Junior was never a Navy SEAL. He had never even enlisted in the armed forces. His photos in military attire were either edited or taken at random events. He deceived friends, family, and even his mother, maintaining an elaborate lie about his supposed military career. Despite having no evidence that he was actually in the military, the officer ignored the penalties and let Junior go without punishment. It was also in 2018 that he met Susie, a woman with whom he had an unstable relationship. They met through Tinder and soon started dating. Susie found Junior attractive and interesting, but she felt that he was cold and distant. When he revealed that he was a Navy SEAL, she attributed his emotional detachment to the rigorous training he supposedly endured. At first, everything seemed normal, but soon, he began disappearing for days without explanation. Despite this, Susie remained involved with him. On the 4th of July holiday in 2019, they decided to take a trip together to Atlantic City, New Jersey. Susie's goal was to spend some quality time with him to strengthen their relationship. She could never have imagined that this trip would turn into a nightmare. In the first few days, Junior began to show his true colors. He became aggressive and violent until one argument escalated to the point where he attempted to strangle Susie. The attack was so brutal that she nearly lost consciousness. From that moment on, she entered survival mode. Her only goal was to leave that trip alive, but the worst was yet to come. In the following days, Junior turned the hotel room into a torture chamber. He not only beat Susie repeatedly, but also subjected her to waterboarding, a military torture technique that simulates drowning for hours. Susie endured this cruel practice. Her salvation came by chance. A hotel employee accidentally entered the room and saw the terrifying scene. She managed to escape and call the police. But by the time officers arrived, Junior had already fled. David. Junior's story was far from over and his violence was only getting worse. Part 4. Assaults, arrest, and the death of his father. After escaping the crime scene in Atlantic City, David Jr. managed to flee in an almost unbelievable way. A warrant was issued for his arrest, but due to an error by the New Jersey police, his name was never entered into the federal system. This meant that no airport, border, or police department in other states knew he was a fugitive. Taking advantage of this failure, he managed to board a flight from New Jersey to Denver, Colorado, and then another flight to Pennsylvania, returning to his hometown without raising any suspicion. If anyone thought that after this cinematic escape he would lay low to avoid capture, they were mistaken. On the contrary, his violence escalated rapidly. 10 days after returning to Pennsylvania, he took a ride with a rideshare driver. During the trip, he punched the driver in the face, simply because the man took a different route than he wanted. The driver managed to call the police and report the assault. But once again, David Jr. fled. He was later found at his home, arrested and charged with assault. But, as absurd as it may seem, he was allowed to post bail and remain free. Why? The Pennsylvania police were unaware that he was already wanted for aggravated assault in New Jersey due to the previous system error. Had he been held in custody at that time, one of the most brutal crimes in history might never have happened. After his return to Pennsylvania, the relationship between David Jr. and his mother, Margaret, became even more strained. Margaret lived in a small townhouse in Bridgeville, where she tried to lead a peaceful life. She enjoyed working at Saks 57 department store, and on her days off, she visited her daughters and grandchildren who lived in other states. Despite years of abuse from her son, Margaret still broke some rules to help him. She knew there was a restraining order against Junior, meaning he wasn't allowed near her. However, as his mother, she could never completely cut ties. It was this dangerous closeness that led to tragedy. On the afternoon of August 31, 2019, one of Margaret's sisters tried calling her multiple times. The reason was sad news. Their only brother, John, had passed away. After numerous unanswered calls, the sister phoned Helen, Margaret's daughter, asking her to try reaching their mother. Concerned, Helen also failed to get a response. She then called Peggy, her sister, but no one knew Margaret's whereabouts. With no other options, Helen decided to try calling David Jr. When he answered, he calmly stated that he had just left his mother's house and that she was fine, just sleeping. Since it was getting late, they decided not to insist. In the US, funerals usually happen a few days after death, unlike in Brazil, where families need to be notified quickly for the wake. The problem was that Margaret's silence continued the next day. On Sunday, no one was able to reach her. Helen tried calling David Jr. again, but he didn't answer until noon. When he finally did, he claimed he had been sleeping at his girlfriend's house, which was a lie, since he and Susie had recently broken up. Still, he assured them he would go to his mother's house to check on her. However, he never called back. Later, Peggy called Margaret's home phone, and this time David Jr. answered. Once again, he claimed his mother was asleep and didn't want to be disturbed. He alleged that she had probably had some wine the night before and was resting. This explanation didn't convince the sisters. Besides the fact that Margaret wasn't known to drink heavily, Jr. wasn't supposed to be near her due to the restraining order. By this point, Margaret's daughters were extremely suspicious. They then called the local police and requested a welfare check at their mother's house. That night, officers went to the address. They rang the doorbell several times, but no one answered. Seeing no signs of activity, the police couldn't do anything else. By law, to enter someone's home, they needed either a warrant or a family member with a key. Helen and Peggy then contacted Margot, a cousin who lived closer to Margaret. The next day, Margot went to her aunt's house, accompanied by the police. What they found inside was a horrifying scene. The door had to be broken down, and as soon as they entered, a strong smell of dried blood and decomposition filled the air. The house was completely ransacked. The carpet and walls were covered in blood. On the living room rug, there were human feces on the floor. A trail of blood led up the stairs to the second floor. With every step, the officers realized they were facing something terrible. When they reached the bathroom, their worst fears were confirmed. Margaret was dead. Her body was inside the bathtub, partially undressed. The position in which she was found indicated that her spine had been broken in half. Next to the bathtub was a handsaw, but despite this, her body had not been dismembered. Upon seeing this brutal scene, the police realized that they were not just dealing with a homicide, but with a crime of extreme violence and cruelty. The investigation began immediately, and all the evidence pointed to one suspect, David Jr. Part 5. The abusive relationship in the Atlantic City escape. Margaret's body was still in the bathtub when forensic experts arrived at the scene. The sight was terrifying. The medical examiner determined that she had suffered multiple scalp lacerations, fractures in nearly all her ribs, and severe spinal injuries, wounds severe enough to leave her paralyzed if she had survived. Her chest was so compressed that it was described as severely collapsed, making it nearly impossible for her to breathe before she died. The intensity of the injuries indicated that the attack had been prolonged and extremely violent. Investigators discovered that in the days leading up to the crime, only David Jr. had been seen entering and leaving his mother's house. Moreover, phone records showed that the day after Margaret's death, purchases were made using her credit card, including cleaning supplies and a rotisserie chicken. The purchase was made at a local store, and the receipt was under Margaret's name, even though she was already dead. Inside the house, officers found clear signs of an attempt to clean up. Various chemicals had been used, but they weren't enough to erase the evidence. Towels, pillows, and blankets were soaked in blood. In the garage trash bin, forensic experts found latex gloves stained with blood, rags used to wipe the crime scene, and receipts from the store where the cleaning supplies had been purchased. Additionally, Margaret's personal belongings, such as jewelry, watches, and designer handbags, were missing. What shocked investigators the most were the images found on David Jr.'s phone. After obtaining a warrant to access his files, police discovered no fewer than 277 photos he had taken during the torture of his own mother. Among them, some showed Margaret sitting on the living room couch, a bloody cloth on her head, crying. Others depicted her body being dragged upstairs and then placed in the bathtub. In one of the final images, David Jr. appears taking a selfie next to his mother's bloodied body, flashing a thumbs up. The photos were horrifying on their own, but the investigation revealed even more disturbing details. In Jr.'s search history, he had Googled phrases like, "How long does it take for a body to start decomposing? How to prevent a body from smelling?" and "What's the best way to drain a body?" These searches were conducted between August 30th and September 1st, the exact period when Margaret was murdered and her body was still in the house. At this point, there was no doubt. David Jr. was responsible for his mother's murder. But where was he? Police feared that he had already fled the state, or worse, the country. The only way to capture him without raising suspicion was to lure him to a location where officers could act quickly. That's when investigators asked Peggy, his sister, to call Jr. and invite him to their uncle's funeral. Since he didn't suspect he was about to be arrested, he accepted the invitation. The moment he left the place where he was staying, police ambushed and arrested him immediately. During the search, officers found a silver necklace, a gold bracelet, and 3 blank checks, all belonging to Margaret. In addition, a key to a hotel room at Hotel Indigo was found in his pocket. When police went to the location, they discovered that inside the room were several of Margaret's designer handbags, a .38 caliber revolver registered in her name, ammunition, credit cards, and jewelry. Despite the overwhelming evidence, David Jr. refused to confess to the crime. During his interrogation, he remained silent. The only person he agreed to speak with was his sister Helen, whom he called that night. When she asked directly if he had killed their mother, his response was cold and calculated. "I can't answer you because I don't want to give you the wrong answer." His emotionless way of handling the situation left his family even more outraged. The fact that a son had murdered his own mother was already brutal enough. But the investigation would soon reveal details that would make this case one of the most shocking ever recorded. Part 6. Margaret's disappearance and the family's concern. David Jr.'s arrest brought relief to Margaret's family, but it also revealed even more disturbing details about his twisted mind. The police obtained a warrant to search his phone, and what they found was terrifying. Beyond the photos of the crime, there were videos showing Jr. washing his mother's body in the bathtub, as if he were trying to clean it before deciding what to do next. He documented everything, recording every detail of what he had done to Margaret, as if he took pleasure in reliving that macabre moment. His cold and calculated behavior was also evident in his Google searches. Just hours after the murder, he looked up information on how to delay a body's decomposition and the best way to dispose of a corpse without being caught. He showed no remorse or guilt. On the contrary, he seemed only concerned with avoiding the consequences of his actions. However, if David Jr. thought he could get away with it, he was mistaken. The police gathered overwhelming evidence and formally charged him with homicide. But there was a problem. Even with all the proof, the prosecution decided to accept a plea deal, allowing him to be convicted of third-degree murder, a much lighter sentence than Margaret's family had expected. The decision caught everyone by surprise. In the U.S., homicide is classified into different degrees. First-degree murder involves premeditation, meaning the killer planned the crime in advance. Second-degree murder occurs when the killing happens in the heat of the moment, without prior planning. Third-degree murder is considered an unintentional killing, often committed under the influence of drugs or alcohol. David Jr.'s defense argued that he was under the influence of alcohol and medication at the time of the crime, trying to justify his brutal act as an impulsive outburst. The prosecutors accepted this argument and offered him a deal that significantly reduced his sentence. Margaret's family was outraged. They believed Jr.'s crime was premeditated, as he had documented everything, researched ways to hide the body, and even attempted to clean the scene. To them, it was clear that he should have been convicted of first-degree murder and spent the rest of his life in prison without parole. During the sentencing hearing, David Jr. gave a theatrical apology. He said he couldn't believe what he had done and thought about it every day. He claimed to be remorseful and said he would never be able to forgive himself. But his words convinced no one. To Margaret's family, it was nothing more than an act, a desperate attempt to soften his image in front of the court. Helen, his sister, made sure to make her feelings clear. In her statement, she said the most disturbing part of the crime wasn't just the brutal murder itself, but the fact that Junior had taken 277 photos of his own mother being tortured. She emphasized that no one records something like that unless they want to relive it later. The outrage was palpable. Another relative called Junior less than a piece of trash and said she wished he had received the death penalty. In the end, the sentence was announced. David Jr. was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison. Since he had already served 3 years in custody while awaiting trial, he could apply for parole in 17 years. This meant that, if granted, he could be released in 2039 at the age of 50. For Margaret's family, this was a crushing blow. They believed the justice system had failed by allowing a cruel murderer like Junior the possibility of one day walking free. But for now at least, they had the certainty that he was behind bars and couldn't hurt anyone else. Meanwhile, Susie, the ex-girlfriend who nearly died at his hands in Atlantic City, was still struggling to overcome the trauma. She continued therapy and tried to rebuild her life, but she knew that as long as David Jr. was alive, she would never feel completely safe. Part 7. A macabre discovery in Margaret's home. With David Jr. in prison, the investigation into Margaret's murder revealed even more disturbing details. The autopsy confirmed that her death was not instantaneous. She suffered for hours, enduring a brutal beating before finally succumbing to her injuries. The severity of the assault was so extreme that forensic experts compared her wounds to those of victims in high-speed car accidents. The evidence found on Junior's phone was crucial in reconstructing the timeline of the crime. The first photos he took showed Margaret still alive, wounded and bleeding, sitting on the living room couch with a look of despair. Minutes later, new images captured her collapsed on the floor, indicating that she had tried to resist but was overpowered by her own son. He documented every moment, recording his violence as if he were proud of what he had done. Among the most disturbing images was a sequence of photos showing Margaret being dragged upstairs. In some, her body was lying in the hallway, while others showed her inside the bathtub, already lifeless. In one of the final images, David Jr. took a selfie next to his mother's corpse, his face smeared with blood, flashing a sinister smile and a thumbs up. Beyond the photos, the search history on his phone revealed chilling details. Shortly before killing his mother, he looked up searches like, "How long does it take for a body to decompose?" and "How to prevent a corpse from smelling." The next day he searched, "What's the best way to drain a body?" and "How to dispose of a body without leaving traces." Forensic experts also discovered that, after killing Margaret Jr., left the house and went to a local supermarket, where he used her credit card to buy cleaning supplies, disposable gloves, and even a rotisserie chicken. Upon returning home, he attempted to clean up the crime scene, but the traces of blood were everywhere. Specialists stated that he spent hours trying to remove evidence before ultimately giving up and simply leaving his mother's body in the bathtub. Another shocking discovery was made at the hotel where Junior had been staying before his arrest. When police searched the room, they found several designer handbags, jewelry, and credit cards belonging to Margaret. Additionally, they recovered a .38 caliber revolver registered in her name, proving that he had not only stolen her belongings, but had also taken the weapon she had bought to protect herself from him. Despite the overwhelming evidence, David Jr. never confessed to the crime. During interrogations, he remained silent or gave vague answers to avoid self-incrimination. When his sister Helen asked him directly if he had killed their mother, he gave an ambiguous response. "I can't give you the wrong answer." The emotional impact of the crime devastated Margaret's family. Helen and Peggy, who had already suffered for years due to their brother's abusive behavior, now had to deal with the pain of losing their mother in such a cruel way. They not only lost Margaret, but also had to live with the fact that the person responsible for her death was their own brother. As the investigation continued, prosecutors worked on building the case against Junior. The evidence was overwhelming, and everything indicated that he would face a severe sentence. However, Margaret's family still didn't know that the justice system would ultimately disappoint them. Part 8. The evidence that confirms the cruelty of the crime. While David Jr. awaited trial in prison, prosecutors gathered all the evidence that demonstrated the brutality of the crime. The images found on his phone were considered undeniable, proof of his guilt, as were his internet searches about body decomposition and evidence concealment. Everything indicated that the crime was premeditated and executed with extreme cruelty. The crime scene analysis showed that Margaret had tried to resist. There were scratch marks and defensive bruises on her arms, indicating that she attempted to protect herself from her son's blows. The bloodstains throughout the house revealed that the attack began in the living room and extended upstairs, ending in the bathroom. The position in which her body was found in the bathtub suggested that she might have been placed there while still alive but was unable to move due to her severe injuries. Police also tracked Junior's movements in the days following the crime. Surveillance footage showed him using his mother's credit card to make purchases, buy personal items, and even dine at an expensive restaurant. For him, Margaret's death seemed to have no emotional impact whatsoever. When confronted with all this evidence, David Jr. remained silent. He never showed remorse and avoided directly answering investigators' questions. His cold demeanor became even more evident when a detective asked if he had anything to say about his mother's death. He simply smiled and looked away without saying a word. The prosecution initially intended to charge him with first-degree murder, which would mean life in prison without the possibility of parole. However, to the shock and outrage of Margaret's family, prosecutors decided to accept a plea deal, reducing the charge to third-degree murder. This decision enraged Helen and Peggy, who believed Junior should spend the rest of his life behind bars. To them, Margaret's murder was clearly premeditated, and the photos and videos of the crime showed that he not only killed their mother, but also took pleasure in documenting her suffering. Despite this, the justice system allowed him to avoid a harsher sentence. When the plea deal was announced, the family was in disbelief. Some relatives openly expressed their frustration, calling the decision a failure of justice. Only one family member agreed with the deal, but their identity was never revealed. For everyone else, it was unacceptable that such a cruel crime would result in such a lenient sentence. During the sentencing hearing, David Jr. read a statement claiming to be remorseful. He said he thought about his mother every day and would never be able to forgive himself, but no one believed him. To Helen, it was nothing more than an act, because at no point had he ever shown any genuine regret. In her testimony, Helen made sure to remind him of the horror he had caused. She described how their mother had been brutally beaten, how he had taken 277 photos documenting her suffering, and how his behavior reflected nothing but coldness and selfishness. She was direct. "You killed our mother and documented everything. No one does that unless they want to relive the moment later." The judge, despite being bound by the plea deal, made a point of emphasizing the severity of the crime. Even so, the sentence was announced: 20 to 40 years in prison. Since Junior had already spent 3 years in custody, he could apply for parole in 17 years, meaning that if approved, he could be released in 2039 at the age of 50. Margaret's family left the courtroom feeling that justice had failed them. To them, no number of years in prison could ever be enough to punish David Jr. for what he had done. But at least they knew that, for now, he couldn't harm anyone else. Meanwhile, Susie, the ex-girlfriend who survived his torture in Atlantic City, was still struggling to recover. She said that while she was relieved to know Junior was in prison, she would never feel completely safe as long as he was alive. David Jr.'s case was not just a brutal crime, but a disturbing example of how someone could manipulate those around them and commit unspeakable acts without showing any remorse. Even behind bars, he still carried the same empty and calculating look of someone who had never learned to value the life of the person who gave him everything. Part 9. The Trial and the Controversial Sentence. David Jr.'s sentencing remained a divisive topic. For the prosecution, accepting the plea deal was the best option, as it guaranteed a conviction without the risk of an uncertain trial. However, for Margaret's family, it was an insult to her memory. They wanted justice and believed the case should have gone before a jury, where the chances of a harsher conviction would have been greater. During the final hearing, several family members spoke. Helen was one of the most direct in her statement. With a firm voice, she described her mother's suffering, recalling the cruelest details of the crime. She made sure to emphasize the 277 photos that Junior had taken, highlighting that no one documents something like that unless they intend to relive the experience later. Other relatives also expressed their outrage. Margaret's eldest sister, Mary, Ellen called David Jr. less than a piece of trash and stated that he should have received the death penalty. To her, the justice system had failed by allowing such a cruel murderer the possibility of one day walking free. Despite the family's emotional statements, the judge's decision had already been made. David Jr. was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 17 years. Since he had already spent 3 years in custody awaiting trial, his first parole hearing could take place as early as 2039, and Jr. had the chance to speak before the sentence was announced. He stood up, looked at his family, and offered an apology. He claimed he couldn't believe what he had done and thought about it every day. He said he would never be able to forgive himself, and that he understood his family's pain. But to those present in the courtroom, his words meant nothing. His expression showed no genuine remorse, and everyone knew he was a manipulator. Inside prison, David Jr. tried to craft a different image for himself. According to prison staff, he behaved well, participated in religious activities, and avoided conflicts with other inmates. At one point, a volunteer who worked at the prison even testified in his favor, claiming that Jr. was seeking redemption and trying to change his life. Margaret's family, however, didn't believe any of it. To them, Jr. was simply playing the system, waiting for the right moment to try to reduce his sentence or secure early release. Despite his conviction, one case against David Jr. was still pending: the Atlantic City assault on Susie. That trial had not yet been concluded. Susie remained determined to bring him to justice, ensuring he faced the consequences for that crime as well. Meanwhile, as the years passed, Margaret's family tried to move on. Helen and Peggy continued to honor their mother's memory, remembering her as the strong, loving, and resilient woman she had always been. But the pain of losing Margaret in such a cruel way never faded. David Jr. may have been sentenced, but to the family, justice was never truly served. The fear that one day he could walk free still haunted them. The only thing they could do was wait, hoping that when his parole hearing came, he would still be considered a threat to society and remain where he belonged, behind bars. Part 10. The Final Verdict and an Uncertain Future. Even after David Jr. was sentenced, Margaret's family still felt that justice had not been fully served. The pain of losing her in such a brutal way was compounded by the knowledge that, one day Jr. could walk free. The idea that he might eventually regain his freedom left them with a sense of unfinished justice. Helen, who had been the most vocal throughout the trial, promised that she would be present at every parole hearing to ensure that her brother never got the chance to re-enter society. For her, it wasn't just about justice for Margaret, it was about protecting others from the monster she had known her entire life. Meanwhile, the case against Jr. for his attack on Susie in Atlantic City was still unresolved. The prosecution had gathered evidence of the horrifying ordeal she suffered, and Susie was determined to testify against him. Although David Jr. was already in prison, she wanted to ensure that he faced legal consequences for the torture she endured. Despite his conviction, Jr. continued to manipulate people even from behind bars. In prison, he portrayed himself as a reformed man, participating in rehabilitation programs, engaging with religious groups, and avoiding conflicts. Some prison staff believed he was truly changing, but those who knew him best, his own family, knew that he was simply playing the system. Margaret's daughters, Helen and Peggy, did their best to move forward with their lives. They clung to the memories of their mother, remembering her for the kindness, strength, and resilience that had defined her. But the weight of what had happened would always stay with them. The crime had not only taken their mother away, it had shattered their entire family. David Jr.'s name became synonymous with horror in Pennsylvania. His case was studied by criminologists, used as an example of extreme violence within families, and debated in legal circles as a case of a failed justice system. The family's biggest fear remained. In 2039, Jr. would be eligible for parole. If granted, he could walk free at 50 years old, still young enough to start over. For Helen, Peggy, and everyone who had suffered at his hands, that was an unbearable thought. But for now, they held on to one certainty. David Jr. was where he belonged, and they would fight to keep him there. What do you think about this story? Do you believe justice was truly served? Or does the system still have flaws? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Your support helps us bring more real-life cases to light.